The stainless steel door swung open at 4:47 a.m. Inside Terminal Island Federal Prison, a man walked into the kitchen with the confidence of someone who owned the place. Not a guard, an inmate. Number 161-38198. And for the next 8 hours, he wouldn't just control what went on the trays. He'd control who ate well and who didn't, who got respect and who got nothing. His name was Jeff Henderson, former crack cocaine kingpin. At age 21, he was pulling in $35,000 a week on the streets of San Diego. By 24, federal agents kicked in his door. The judge gave him 19.5 years. But here's what nobody expected. Behind bars, Henderson would build a different kind of empire. Not with drugs, with food. Because in prison, food is power. Food is currency. Food is survival. And the man who controlled the kitchen controlled the block. Rosario Sal Gambino, the nephew of a New York mob boss, would wait in line for Henderson's chicken. Michael Milken, the fallen Wall Street titan, requested his cheesecake. Even the guards broke protocol. They'd walk past security cameras, slip into the cell block, and whisper, "Hey Henderson, what you got?" This is the story of how an inmate with a 10-year sentence crushed Doritos in a sock for seasoning, broke every unwritten rule about inmate status, and turned a prison kitchen into his personal kingdom. It's a story about survival, about transformation, and about the hidden power structure inside America's prisons that most people never see. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy true crime stories like this, be sure to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. Because what Jeff Henderson discovered in that kitchen would change everything. Not just for him, but for everyone around him. And it started with the one thing every inmate craves more than freedom: a decent meal. If you enjoy real, gripping prison documentaries and true stories, don't forget to like this video, leave a comment, and share it with your friends and family. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss more shocking and exclusive content. The hierarchy of hunger. Terminal Island wasn't like the prisons you see in movies. No gangs running wild in the yard. No riots or stabbings every other week. This was a federal facility. Low to medium security. White-collar criminals. Drug offenders. Mafia associates serving out their sentences in relative quiet. But don't mistake quiet for equal. Even in federal prison, there's a hierarchy. And at Terminal Island in the early 1990s, that hierarchy started in the kitchen. Jeff Henderson learned this on his first day. He'd been transferred from a county jail where the food was barely edible. Processed meat that could have been anything. Vegetables boiled until they lost all color. Bread that tasted like cardboard. You ate to survive, not to live. Terminal Island was different. The prison employed inmate workers in the kitchen. Real cooking happened there. And Henderson, who'd grown up watching his mother and grandmother cook Sunday dinners in South Central Los Angeles, saw an opportunity. But getting into the kitchen wasn't automatic. According to Bureau of Prisons data from that era, kitchen jobs were among the most sought-after work assignments in federal facilities. Better conditions, access to ingredients, the ability to make your own food, and most importantly, social capital. An inmate named Larry, documented in academic research on prison labor, ran the kitchen clerk position at another federal facility during the same period. Larry didn't cook. He managed. He controlled job assignments. He decided who got hired and who got fired. He ordered supplies. He had access to the storage room. And with that access came power that extended far beyond the kitchen walls. Larry could get you coffee when coffee wasn't available on commissary. Sugar, salt, hot sauce, spices that made prison food bearable. He traded these items for favors, for protection, for status. Kitchen workers, according to researchers who studied prison hierarchies, enjoyed privileges that other inmates couldn't access. They ate better, always. While the general population choked down whatever came on the standard meal trays, kitchen workers could prepare their own food using institutional ingredients. A plain baked potato became loaded with extras. Chicken got seasoned properly. Vegetables weren't cooked into mush. Henderson noticed this immediately. He also noticed who ran the kitchen at Terminal Island. The head inmate cook wasn't the toughest guy, wasn't connected to any criminal organization, wasn't serving the longest sentence. He was simply the best cook. And in a population of inmates who'd been eating garbage for months or years, that made him royalty. Henderson had dealt drugs since he was a teenager. He understood supply and demand. He understood that the person who controlled the supply controlled everything. On the streets, that supply was cocaine. In prison, it was food. So he applied for kitchen work. The initial assignment was basic: cleaning duties, washing industrial-sized pots and pans, mopping floors, taking out trash. It was the bottom of the kitchen hierarchy, but it was inside. And being inside meant learning. Henderson watched everything. He watched how the head cook seasoned the food that went to certain inmates versus others. He watched how kitchen workers saved the best cuts of meat for themselves. He watched how a well-timed favor, a plate prepared with extra care, could earn loyalty from someone powerful. He also watched what happened when the food was bad. Tensions rose. Arguments broke out. Inmates who might normally keep quiet about disrespect would confront others over a shorted meal. Food wasn't just nutrition. It was one of the only pleasures available. Taking that away, or degrading it, was an act of aggression. But elevating it, that was power. If you enjoy real, gripping prison documentaries and true stories, don't forget to like this video, leave a comment, and share it with your friends and family. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss more shocking and exclusive content. Henderson started experimenting during his off hours. The kitchen had limitations. No fancy ingredients. No fresh herbs beyond the basics. No wine for deglazing. But there were fundamentals: onions, garlic, peppers, spices in the industrial storage area that went largely unused because nobody knew what to do with them. And there were staples from commissary. This is where Henderson's innovation changed the game. He realized that the bland, institutional ingredients could be transformed using items available through the prison store. Doritos, for instance, crushed into powder, they became seasoning. The cheese dust and salt created flavor where none existed. Other inmates thought he was crazy, putting chips in a sock and grinding them down, until they tasted the results. Hot Cheetos dust on chicken. Ramen noodle seasoning packets used to create complex flavor bases. Instant coffee mixed with cocoa powder for dessert elements. Henderson was reverse engineering recipes using what was available, and the food started tasting like something from the outside world. Word spread fast in a confined environment. Inmates who'd been inside for 5, 10, 15 years started requesting Henderson's cooking. Not asking, requesting. The difference mattered, because in prison, asking means you're weak. Requesting means you recognize someone's value. And Henderson's value was rising. The head cook noticed. The kitchen supervisor, a civilian employee, noticed. Even the guards noticed because they started eating the food too. Correctional officers at federal facilities aren't supposed to accept food from inmates. It's a violation of protocol, a potential security issue, a blurring of the line between authority and incarceration. But Henderson's food was that good. Guards would time their rounds to pass by the kitchen during meal prep. They'd pause, make small talk, and Henderson, reading the room the way he'd read the streets, would offer a plate. Just tasting, he'd say, quality control, making sure it's good enough for the population. Nobody refused. This created a protection most inmates couldn't buy. Guards who ate Henderson's food had a vested interest in him staying in the kitchen, in him staying safe, in him continuing to cook. It wasn't a formal arrangement. It was something more subtle and more powerful. Mutual benefit. Within 6 months, Henderson wasn't mopping floors anymore. He was cooking, main dishes, managing stations, training new kitchen workers. The head cook, seeing Henderson's skill and the response it generated, gave him more responsibility. Not out of kindness, out of recognition that Henderson made everyone's life better. The inmates were happier. The guards were happier. The kitchen ran smoother. And in prison, smooth is survival. But Henderson's rise created something unexpected. Resentment. Because there's always someone who views another person's success as their own loss. In this case, it was an inmate who'd been in the kitchen longer. who felt he deserved the position Henderson now held, who didn't appreciate an outsider, a drug dealer with no formal training, getting recognition. The tension simmered for weeks. Then, one morning, Henderson found his station sabotaged, ingredients missing, tools moved, small acts of interference designed to make him look incompetent during the breakfast service. In prison, you can't run to authority. You can't file a complaint. You handle it yourself, or you accept being a target. Henderson handled it with food. He prepared a special meal, not for the inmate causing problems, for that inmate's friends, his associates, the people whose opinion mattered to him. Henderson made them the best breakfast they'd had in years. Eggs cooked perfectly, hash browns crispy on the outside, soft inside, toast buttered while hot, coffee strong and fresh. And when they asked why, Henderson said simply, "I cook for everyone who respects the work." The message was clear. Respect the kitchen, eat well. Disrespect it, get the standard tray. Within a week, the sabotage stopped. The resentful inmate found himself isolated because nobody wanted to risk losing access to Henderson's cooking over someone else's ego. The prison economy had shifted. Food was the currency, and Henderson controlled the mint. But this was just the beginning, because Henderson hadn't yet met the inmates who would change everything. The ones whose names carried weight far beyond Terminal Island's fences. The ones who'd teach him that cooking in prison wasn't just about food. It was about power, about respect, about building an empire from nothing. And the first of those inmates was about to walk through the kitchen door. The mobster's nephew, Rosario Sal Gambino, arrived at Terminal Island on a Tuesday. The nephew of a New York crime family boss, convicted on racketeering charges. He walked into the facility with a reputation that preceded him by 3,000 miles. In the federal system, names like Gambino still carried weight, even if the glory days of organized crime were fading. Henderson first heard about him from other inmates. Mob guy coming in. Real deal. Not some associate or wannabe. In prison, celebrity status exists on a different scale than the outside world. A former NFL player, a disgraced politician, a Wall Street executive who'd made headlines. These people arrived with built-in respect, not because of what they did, but because of who they'd been. Rosario Gambino was that kind of arrival. Henderson didn't care. He'd sold drugs to millionaires and homeless people alike. Money was money. Status meant nothing if you couldn't back it up. But he understood that Gambino's presence would shift dynamics. Other inmates would seek his favor, try to associate with him, use proximity to a mob name for protection or credibility. What Henderson didn't expect was for Gambino to seek him out. It happened during breakfast service, 3 days after Gambino's arrival. Henderson was working the main line, plating eggs and hash browns. The portions were standard. The quality wasn't. He'd seasoned the potatoes with a mixture that included crushed Doritos, garlic powder, and black pepper. The eggs had real butter worked in, not the margarine substitute from the standard kitchen supply. Gambino came through the line like everyone else. No special treatment. No kutin. He waited his turn, tray in hand, and when he reached Henderson's station, he paused, looked at the food, looked at Henderson, said 5 words. "This smells like real food." Henderson nodded, kept working, didn't stop to chat or seek approval. That was important. In prison, desperation shows, and desperate people get exploited. Henderson had learned on the streets that the way to command respect was to act like you didn't need it. Gambino took his tray and left. But the next morning, he came through the line again, and the morning after that, and each time, he'd make a small comment. Professional observation. Not praise exactly. Recognition. Henderson had worked in kitchens long enough to know the difference. Then came the request. Gambino approached Henderson in the yard during rec time. Walked up directly, no intermediary, which itself was notable. In prison hierarchies documented by researchers, high-status inmates typically use lower-status inmates to make requests. It maintains distance, preserves the pecking order. Gambino didn't do that. "You know how to make chicken parm?" he asked. Henderson considered the question. Chicken parmesan required ingredients the prison kitchen didn't stock. Fresh mozzarella, real marinara sauce made from scratch, quality Parmesan cheese, breadcrumbs that weren't stale. But it also required technique. And technique Henderson had. I can make a version, Henderson said. Won't be like your grandmother's, but it'll be better than anything else you'll get in here. Gambino smiled. Not warm. Approving. Friday night. My cell. I'll get the word to the guards. That was how it worked with inmates like Gambino. They had arrangements. Informal agreements with correctional staff that allowed certain privileges. Nothing major. Nothing that compromised security. But enough flexibility to make time pass easier. A cell block officer might look the other way during a card game. Might allow an extra phone call. Might permit a meal prepared specially, as long as it didn't cause problems. Henderson had 48 hours to figure out prison chicken parmesan. He started by inventorying what he could access. The kitchen had chicken, obviously. Institutional grade, frozen in bulk, but workable. There was tomato paste and canned tomatoes. Garlic, onions, basic Italian seasonings. For cheese, he needed to improvise. The prison commissary sold mozzarella sticks. Processed, pre-breaded, meant to be microwaved. But cheese was cheese. Henderson bought $20 worth from his account. Other inmates thought he'd lost his mind, spending that much on snacks. They didn't understand the investment. For Parmesan, he traded with another kitchen worker who had a connection to the commissary stockroom. Got access to the powdered Parmesan in bulk containers, the kind used for pizza. Not ideal, but functional. The breadcrumbs required creativity. Henderson saved bread for multiple meals. Let go stale. Crushed it down. Mixed in Italian seasoning, garlic powder, and a secret ingredient. Crushed cheese, it's from commissary. The crackers added salt and a sharpness that approximated real Parmesan in the coating. Friday arrived. Henderson started prep during his regular kitchen shift. The civilian supervisor knew something was happening, but didn't ask questions. That was the unspoken rule. As long as the regular meals got prepared on time and nobody complained, kitchen workers had latitude to do side projects. He butterflied the chicken breasts, pounded them thin using a small pot wrapped in plastic, created an assembly line, flour seasoned with salt and pepper, beaten eggs mixed with a little milk, his homemade breadcrumb mixture. The breading technique mattered. Press firmly. Get complete coverage. Let it rest so the coating adheres. These were fundamentals his grandmother had taught him Sunday mornings in South Central, preparing fried chicken for after church. For the sauce, Henderson built flavor in layers. Sautéed onions and garlic until fragrant. Added tomato paste, let it caramelize slightly. Poured in crushed tomatoes. Seasoned with basil, oregano, a pinch of sugar to cut the acidity. Let it simmer for an hour, reducing and intensifying. The chicken went into a pan with just enough oil to crisp the coating. Not deep frying. Pan frying. Controlling the temperature by adjusting the burner, listening to the sizzle, watching the color develop. Golden brown. Not burned. Not pale. Then assembly. Chicken on a plate. Sauce over the top. Mozzarella sticks pulled apart and layered on. Then hit with a kitchen torch to melt. Powdered Parmesan dusted over everything. A sprinkle of dried basil for color. It wasn't Little Italy, but it was closer than anything Terminal Island had seen. Henderson plated 3 portions. 1 for Gambino, 2 for whoever Gambino was sharing with. Prison meals were communal among those with status. Food shared was loyalty built. A guard Henderson had fed multiple times escorted him to Gambino's cell block during the evening count. Walked him past security checkpoints that normally would have stopped an inmate carrying food. Didn't say a word. Just nodded and opened doors. Gambino's cell looked like most federal cells. 8 by 10 feet. Bunk bed. Small desk. Toilet and sink. But the personal items told a different story. Photos of family members. Letters in neat stacks. Books about Italian history. This was a man maintaining connection to his identity despite the circumstances. 2 other inmates were there. Both older. Both with that same quiet authority that came from a lifetime in organized crime. Henderson placed the plates down. Stepped back. Waited. Gambino cut into the chicken. The coating crunched. Steam rose. He took a bite. Chewed slowly. His expression didn't change immediately, which made Henderson's heart rate increase despite himself. Then Gambino closed his eyes. "Madonna," he said quietly. "This tastes like Sunday dinner." The other two inmates tried theirs. Similar reactions. Not exaggerated. Not performative. Just genuine appreciation from men who hadn't tasted home in years. Gambino looked at Henderson. "You got talent, kid. Real talent. What are you doing in here?" Henderson could have said drugs. Could have given a short answer. But something about the moment, the respect in the room, made him tell the truth. "I got greedy. Thought I was smarter than the system. Turned out I wasn't." Gambino nodded. "We all think that. Every single one of us in here thought we'd be the exception." He paused. "But this is different. You can do something with this when you get out." It was the first time anyone in prison had talked to Henderson about an after. About life beyond the fences. Most conversations focused on surviving the present, getting through the sentence, making parole. But Gambino was talking about building something. "You keep cooking like this," Gambino continued. "I'll make sure people know. I still got connections outside. Restaurants. Businesses. You decide you want to go legitimate with this, I can open doors." Henderson didn't know if it was a real offer or just talk. In prison, promises were cheap. But the seed was planted. The idea that cooking could be more than survival. That it could be a future. From that night forward, Gambino became Henderson's protector without ever saying it explicitly. Other inmates noticed that Gambino requested Henderson's cooking, that they talked in the yard, that there was a relationship based on mutual respect. And in prison, being associated with someone like Gambino meant safety, meant status, meant that the other power players in the facility saw you as connected. But it also meant expectations. Because word spread fast about the chicken parmesan. Within a week, Henderson had 3 more requests from high-profile inmates. Each one wanted something specific, something that reminded them of life before. And each one was willing to trade commissary items, money on their books, or favors to get it. Henderson was no longer just a kitchen worker. He was becoming a chef, a provider of something scarce and valuable in a place where everything was scarce and most things had no value at all. But with that power came exposure. Because not everyone in Terminal Island appreciated Henderson's rise. Some saw it as an opportunity. Others saw it as a threat. And one inmate, someone with connections to a prison gang that operated across the federal system, saw it as something he could control. That inmate's name was Marcus Webb, and he was about to test whether Henderson's cooking skills could protect him from something far more dangerous than bad food. The elitists. Rosario Sal Gambino didn't wait in line. Not for anything, and certainly not for food. At Terminal Island in the early 1990s, Gambino was serving a 45-year sentence for running one of the largest heroin operations in American history. The Cherry Hill Gambinos, as his family's operation was known, had smuggled an estimated $600 million worth of heroin into the United States over a decade. Sal and his brothers Giuseppe and Giovanni had been made members of the Gambino crime family in 1975, inducted by Paul Castellano himself, a distant relative. This wasn't some street-level dealer doing time. This was mafia royalty, connected to Carlo Gambino's lineage, part of one of New York's 5 families. And even behind bars, that status carried weight. Henderson saw it immediately. The morning Gambino's name appeared on the kitchen request list, the head cook pulled Henderson aside. He explained who Gambino was, what he represented, and what it meant to cook for him. This wasn't just another inmate wanting better food. This was a test, because men like Gambino had expectations. They'd eaten at the finest restaurants in New York, Little Italy establishments where chefs knew their names, where meals were prepared with imported ingredients and generational recipes. Prison was supposed to humble everyone, strip away the status, make everyone equal in orange jumpsuits. But that was theory. In practice, Terminal Island during this era housed what inmates and staff sarcastically called Club Federal. White-collar criminals, organized crime figures, financial fraudsters, men who'd lived lives of luxury before conviction. Michael Milken, the junk bond king who'd controlled billions on Wall Street. Ivan Boesky, the arbitrager whose insider trading made him a symbol of 1980s excess. Jeffrey McDonald, the Green Beret physician convicted of murdering his family. These weren't hardened, violent offenders. They were educated, sophisticated, elite criminals. And they brought their elitism with them. Henderson noticed the difference in the chow line. The white-collar inmates would approach with visible disdain. They'd look at the standard meal trays the way someone might look at garbage. Some of them barely ate. Others survived primarily on commissary purchases, assembling their own meals in their cells rather than consuming institutional food. This created a problem for the kitchen staff, because federal prison regulations required that every inmate receive 3 meals daily. But when high-profile inmates refuse to eat, it becomes a health issue. A potential lawsuit, a bureaucratic nightmare for administrators trying to maintain the appearance that conditions were adequate. So accommodations were made, unofficial ones. Gambino never entered the main chow line. According to Henderson's later accounts, men like Gambino would send word to the kitchen about their preferences. Not requests. Preferences. The distinction mattered. A request implies someone might say no. A preference implies you're informing them of what will happen. Henderson was about to discover what Gambino's preference was. Chicken. Not the baked, over-seasoned chicken that went out to the general population. Not the grilled chicken breast that dried out under heat lamps. Gambino wanted fried chicken. Real fried chicken. The kind with crispy skin and juicy meat. The kind that required technique and timing and attention that institutional cooking rarely provided. And Henderson knew how to make it. He'd grown up in South Central Los Angeles watching his grandmother fry chicken. Sunday dinners where the whole family gathered. The smell of hot oil and seasoned flour. The sound of chicken hitting the pan. The golden brown result that disappeared within minutes as everyone reached for seconds. But in prison, there were limitations. No freire. No buttermilk for brining. No fresh herbs. The kitchen had ovens, stovetops, limited spices, and institutional ingredients designed for volume, not quality. Henderson improvised. He used the commissary items he'd been experimenting with. Crushed Doritos for seasoning the flour mixture. Hot sauce mixed with water to create a brine substitute. He controlled the oven temperature precisely, starting high to create the crust, then lowering it to cook the meat through. He timed everything perfectly, knowing that Gambino would receive it within a specific window. The first batch went out on a Tuesday afternoon. Henderson plated it himself, not on a standard meal tray, on actual plates that were normally reserved for staff. He added a side that he'd prepared separately, small touches that signaled this wasn't standard prison food. The response came back within an hour, not through official channels, through the prison grapevine. Word spread fast in confined populations. Gambino had eaten the chicken, all of it, and he'd sent word back. One phrase, "Tell Henderson it's good." 3 words that changed everything. Because in the prison economy, Rosario Gambino's endorsement was currency. If Gambino approved of Henderson's cooking, that approval carried weight with every Italian inmate, every mob-connected prisoner, every white-collar criminal who respected the old-school hierarchy. Within days, Henderson's cell was receiving visitors. Not guards conducting searches. Not threats or extortion. Visitors who wanted to discuss food. Inmates who'd heard about the chicken. Who wanted to know if Henderson could prepare other dishes. Who offered to pay in commissary items, in favors, in protection. Henderson had inadvertently started an underground catering business. He called it that in later interviews, though at the time there was no formal name. It was simply understood. If you wanted better food, you came to Henderson. If Henderson cooked for you, you compensated him somehow. The prison economy functioned on barter since cash was contraband. Stamps became currency. Coffee. Cigarettes before they were banned. Phone cards. Extra clothing items. Henderson accumulated all of it. Not because he needed these items necessarily, but because accumulation meant power. It meant he could trade for other things. Better cleaning supplies for his cell. A radio that actually worked. Small comforts that made incarceration more bearable. But more importantly, it meant protection. Because Henderson's value extended beyond his cell block. Guards who enjoyed his food became protective. Inmates who ate well from his cooking had vested interests in his safety. The kitchen supervisor appreciated that Henderson's work reduced complaints and tensions. Michael Milken became another regular customer. The man who'd once controlled junk bond markets, who'd made over $1 billion before his conviction for securities violations, was requesting Henderson's microwave cheesecake. Henderson would take graham crackers from commissary, crush them for crust, mix cream cheese with sugar and vanilla, microwave it in careful intervals to prevent curdling, and create desserts that rivaled what Milken had eaten at Manhattan restaurants. The irony wasn't lost on Henderson. Here he was, a convicted crack dealer from South Central, cooking for Wall Street titans and organized crime figures. Men who in the outside world would never have associated with him. Men who'd lived in penthouses while Henderson sold drugs from trap houses. But in prison, skill erased certain boundaries. Henderson had something they wanted, something money couldn't buy behind bars. The ability to make incarceration slightly less miserable through food that reminded them of freedom. There was another inmate, according to Henderson's accounts, who requested top ramen creations. Not the standard package and water preparation that most inmates survived on. Henderson would take the noodles, discard the standard seasoning packet, cook them properly, then add ingredients he'd accumulated. Onions sautéed until caramelized. Hard-boiled eggs sliced thin. Red onions for bite. Protein when available. He'd transform a 40-cent commissary item into something that resembled actual Japanese ramen. These weren't large meals. Prison logistics prevented that. But they were moments. Brief windows where inmates could close their eyes while eating and forget where they were. Taste something that connected them to their former lives. And Henderson became essential to providing those moments. But this success created vulnerability. Because in any prison, there are inmates who view another person's success as an insult, who believe that respect is zero-sum. That Henderson getting recognition meant they were losing it. One of these inmates was connected to a different organization. Not Italian mob, not white collar. A prisoner who'd been inside longer, who'd established his own systems, who didn't appreciate Henderson's rise, disrupting the existing hierarchy. The threat came indirectly, through another inmate. A message that Henderson's business was causing problems, that certain people felt disrespected, that maybe Henderson should remember he was just another convict and act accordingly. In most prisons, this would escalate to violence. A confrontation in the yard, an ambush in a blind spot. Prison violence follows predictable patterns when respect is challenged. But Henderson didn't respond with aggression. He responded with strategy, because he'd learned something crucial during his time in the kitchen. Violence was temporary. Fear faded. But being indispensable? That lasted. Henderson reached out to Gambino. Not directly, but through the network he'd built. He made sure Gambino understood that if Henderson's operation was disrupted, certain people wouldn't be eating as well, including Gambino. The threat evaporated within 48 hours. No confrontación. No dramatic standoff. Just word coming back through channels that Henderson was all right and should be left alone. This was power. Real power. Not the power to hurt someone, which any inmate with nothing to lose could exercise, but the power to have someone else protect you. To be valuable enough that influential people intervened on your behalf without being asked. Henderson had learned the most important lesson about prison hierarchies. You don't survive by being the toughest. You survive by being necessary. And as long as Rosario Gambino wanted his chicken, Henderson was very necessary. The transformation. Henderson had 8 years left on his sentence when he realized something critical. Power in prison was temporary. Influence behind bars meant nothing once you crossed back through those gates. And every day he stayed inside, the world outside was changing. Technology advancing. Opportunities disappearing. The longer an inmate stayed incarcerated, the harder re-entry became. Statistics from the Bureau of Justice showed that over 2/3 of released prisoners were rearrested within 3 years. The recidivism rate for federal drug offenders hovered around 70%. Most inmates left prison with nothing except a release date and a criminal record. No skills, no connections, no path forward. Henderson understood this mathematics. He'd built an empire in the kitchen, but that empire existed within 20-foot concrete walls. The question wasn't whether he could cook for mobsters and Wall Street criminals. The question was whether he could cook anywhere else. So he started preparing for release. Not 3 months before his parole hearing. 8 years before. The transformation began with education. Henderson had dropped out of high school to sell drugs. He'd never read a book cover to cover before prison. Never taken formal coursework. Never developed skills beyond street-level drug distribution and survival instincts. But Terminal Island offered educational programs, GED classes, vocational training, self-improvement courses that most inmates ignored because they didn't offer early release or commissary credits. Henderson enrolled in everything available. He earned his high school equivalency diploma. He took business courses, learning basic accounting and management principles. He read voraciously, self-help books, biographies of successful people, newspapers like the Los Angeles Times and USA Today to stay connected to current events. He watched 60 Minutes in 2020, studying how successful people presented themselves, how they spoke, how they carry themselves. According to Henderson's later accounts, this period of self-education was as important as his cooking skills, because the kitchen gave him leverage inside prison. But education would give him leverage outside. He also joined the Nation of Islam, not because he'd suddenly become deeply religious, but because the organization provided structure, brotherhood, mentorship from older inmates who'd transformed themselves. The social component attracted Henderson, men who'd been gang members and dealers, who'd found purpose beyond criminal identity. Through the Nation, Henderson learned about Black history, African achievements that public schools had never taught him, scientists, educators, builders, intellectuals who looked like him, men who'd overcome systemic barriers to create legacies. For the first time, Henderson saw models of success that didn't involve drugs or sports or entertainment. But the real preparation happened in the kitchen. In 1992, 5 years into his sentence, Henderson was transferred to Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada. Federal inmates with good behavior could be assigned to work programs at military installations. Nellis operated a dining facility that served Air Force personnel, and the kitchen standards were significantly higher than typical prison food service. Henderson worked in that dining hall for months, learning institutional cooking at a professional scale, meal preparation for hundreds, inventory management, food safety protocols. Everything was documented, regulated, inspected. It was his first exposure to kitchen operations that resembled real restaurants. Then came the opportunity that changed everything. Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama operated a culinary training school for inmates. Not a casual job assignment. An actual vocational program designed to teach restaurant-quality cooking skills. Inmates had to apply, had to have clean disciplinary records, had to demonstrate commitment. Henderson was accepted in 1994. The Maxwell program taught techniques he'd never learned at Terminal Island. Proper knife skills, sauce preparations, baking fundamentals, French cooking terminology that professional kitchens used. The instructors were civilian chefs who'd worked in real restaurants, and they treated the program like an actual culinary school. For Henderson, this was validation. Proof that cooking wasn't just something he'd stumbled into for survival. It was a legitimate career path, a skill that could translate to employment on the outside. But there was still a massive obstacle. Henderson was a convicted felon, a drug trafficker with a federal record. The restaurant industry didn't typically hire ex-convicts for kitchen positions. Background checks eliminated candidates with criminal histories before they reached the interview stage. And even if Henderson got an interview, how would he explain the 10-year gap in his work history? Other inmates told him to forget it, suggested he focus on transitional jobs, warehouse work, construction, manual labor positions that didn't require clean backgrounds. But Henderson had watched too many released inmates return to Terminal Island within months. Guys who tried going straight but couldn't find decent work, who fell back into old patterns because legitimate employment wasn't accessible. Henderson decided he needed a strategy. He started researching chefs, specifically successful Black chefs who'd broken barriers in an industry dominated by European culinary tradition. He found 3 names that kept appearing. Marcus Samuelson, a chef making waves in New York. Patrick Clark, who'd become executive chef at prestigious Manhattan restaurants, and Robert Gadsby, operating his own fine dining establishment in Beverly Hills. These weren't celebrity TV personalities. They were working chefs running actual kitchens at high-end restaurants. Men who'd navigated an industry that rarely gave black professionals executive positions. If Henderson could learn from them, work under them, maybe he could find a path forward. He wrote letters. From his cell at Maxwell, Henderson composed professional correspondence explaining his situation. He was honest about his criminal history, about his sentence, about his transformation in prison. He explained what he'd learned, what he could offer, and what he was asking for. Not a handout, an opportunity to prove himself. Most letters went unanswered. Some received polite rejections. The restaurant industry moved fast, and most executive chefs didn't have time to mentor ex-convicts with no professional experience. But Henderson kept writing, kept refining his pitch, kept studying culinary magazines and restaurant reviews to understand what these chefs valued. He wasn't just asking for a job. He was demonstrating that he'd done the research, that he understood their work, that he respected their achievements. Meanwhile, his release date was approaching. In 1996, after serving 9.5 years of his 19.5-year sentence, Henderson was released on parole. Federal guidelines allowed early release for inmates with clean records and successful rehabilitation efforts. Henderson qualified on both counts. He walked out of federal custody with $300 in release funds, a box of personal belongings, and letters of recommendation from the Maxwell Culinary Program instructors. No job, no apartment, no car, just a parole officer's address and a list of reentry requirements. Henderson moved to Los Angeles. He stayed with family temporarily while navigating the bureaucracy of parole. Regular check-ins, employment verification requirements, travel restrictions. The conditions of supervised release meant one violation could send him back inside. Finding employment proved exactly as difficult as he'd anticipated. Restaurant after restaurant rejected his applications. Some managers were blunt. They didn't hire felons. Period. Others were more diplomatic, explaining that insurance requirements or corporate policies prevented them from considering candidates with criminal records. A few didn't even respond after Henderson disclosed his background. He applied for dishwasher positions, prep cook roles, anything that would get him into a kitchen. Most applications died after the background check. Then Chef Robert Gadsby responded to one of Henderson's letters. Gadsby operated Gadsby's restaurant in Beverly Hills, a fine dining establishment known for California cuisine with French influences. He'd read Henderson's letter months earlier and filed it away. But when Henderson followed up after his release, explaining he was living in L.A. and still interested in learning, Gadsby agreed to meet. The interview was straightforward. Gadsby asked about Henderson's cooking experience, his training, his understanding of professional kitchen operations. Henderson was honest. He'd cooked for inmates and guards in federal prison. He'd completed vocational training at Maxwell. He could follow recipes and execute techniques. But he'd never worked in a real restaurant kitchen. Gadsby could have rejected him there. Most chefs would have. Ex-convict with no professional experience, asking for a position at a Beverly Hills restaurant where celebrities dined, and wealthy clients expected perfection. But Gadsby made a different calculation. He saw work ethic, saw someone who'd spent nearly a decade preparing for this opportunity, saw potential that might never materialize if someone didn't take a chance. He hired Henderson as a dishwasher. The position paid minimum wage, $7.50 per hour in 1996. Henderson would work 10-hour shifts scrubbing pots, cleaning stations, handling the manual labor that kept the kitchen running. It wasn't cooking. It wasn't what he'd envisioned after Maxwell, but it was inside a professional kitchen. And Henderson understood something crucial. Every successful chef, including Gadsby himself, had started somewhere low, had paid dues, had proven themselves before earning better positions. So Henderson washed dishes. He arrived early, stayed late, kept his station spotless, helped wherever needed without being asked. And most importantly, he watched everything. He watched how the line cooks prepared dishes during service. how they organized their stations for efficiency, how they communicated with each other during rush periods. He watched how Gadsby moved through the kitchen, tasting everything, adjusting seasonings, maintaining quality control. And he asked questions. During slow periods, Henderson would approach the cooks and ask about techniques, why they cut vegetables certain ways, how they knew when proteins were properly cooked, what spices worked with specific dishes. Some cooks were dismissive. The dishwasher, asking about cooking, was overstepping boundaries. But others appreciated genuine curiosity. They'd show Henderson knife techniques during prep time, let him taste sauces to understand flavor profiles, explain the logic behind cooking temperatures and timing. 3 months into the dishwasher position, one of Gadsby's line cooks quit unexpectedly, left during a shift without notice, creating a critical shortage during dinner service. The kitchen was understaffed, and Gadsby needed someone who could at least handle basic prep work while he reshuffled responsibilities. He looked at Henderson, the ex-convict dishwasher who showed up every day, worked without complaining, and clearly wanted to learn. "You know how to make a vinaigrette?" Gadsby asked. Henderson did. He'd learned it at Maxwell. Basic emulsion technique. Oil, vinegar, mustard, seasoning. Make it. If it's good, you're helping on prep tonight. Henderson made the vinaigrette. Gadsby tasted it, nodded, and just like that, Henderson was on the line. Not permanently, not as an official promotion, just filling a gap during an emergency. But it was a test, and Henderson passed. Over the next year, Henderson worked his way from dishwasher to prep cook to line cook under Gadsby's mentorship. Every position taught him something essential. Prep work taught precision and consistency. Line cooking taught speed and multitasking. Working under Gadsby's direct supervision taught refinement and attention to detail that separated good cooking from great cooking. Gadsby pushed him, criticized harshly when dishes weren't perfect, demanded that Henderson learn proper French culinary terms, made him practice knife skills until his cuts were uniform, refused to accept the explanation that Henderson had cooked for inmates, and that was good enough. Because Gadsby understood what Henderson needed to learn. Prison cooking was survival. Restaurant cooking was art. And if Henderson wanted a real career, he needed to master both the technical skills and the professional discipline that high-end kitchens demanded. In 1997, after a year under Gadsby's mentorship, Henderson felt ready to move forward. He'd absorbed everything Gadsby could teach him. He'd proven himself in a professional environment, and he was ready for bigger opportunities. He applied to positions at some of Los Angeles' most prestigious hotels, the Coronado Island Marriott, the Ritz-Carlton in Marina del Rey, the Hotel Bel Air, L'Hermitage, Beverly Hills. These weren't just restaurants. They were luxury properties where guests paid premium prices and expected world-class service. Their kitchens employed trained chefs with formal culinary education and years of professional experience. Henderson still had a criminal record, still had a felony conviction that appeared on every background check. But now he had something else. A letter of recommendation from Robert Gadsby. Verification that an established, respected chef had trained him and trusted his abilities. That made the difference. The Hotel Bel Air hired him as a line cook. Then L'Hermitage brought him on for their kitchen staff. Henderson was building a resume. Real professional experience at recognized establishments. Each position taught new techniques, exposed him to different cuisines, connected him with other chefs in the industry. But he wasn't in LA to work line cook positions forever. He had a specific goal, a city where the restaurant scene was exploding, where new hotels were opening massive properties with multiple kitchens, where executive chef positions were available to people with talent, regardless of background. Las Vegas. And in 1999, after 3 years building his professional reputation in Los Angeles, Jeff Henderson packed his belongings and drove northeast toward the Nevada desert, toward the opportunity that would either prove his transformation was real or confirm that ex-convicts couldn't escape their pasts. Everything he'd built in prison and after was about to face the ultimate test, the reckoning. The gate opened at 6:23 a.m. on March 28, 1996. Jeff Henderson walked out of Terminal Island Federal Prison carrying everything he owned in a single plastic bag. A few books, some papers, letters from his mother. He'd served 9 years and 8 months of his 19-and-a-half-year sentence. Good behavior. Model inmate. The head prison cook who'd fed white-collar criminals and mob associates better than they'd eaten in years. None of that mattered now. The world Henderson stepped into was completely different from the one he'd left in 1988. Cell phones existed. The internet was expanding. Hip-hop had gone mainstream. The crack epidemic that made him $35,000 a week was fading, replaced by new drugs, new dealers, new victims. And Henderson was 32 years old with a felony record, no high school diploma when he'd entered prison, and a skill set that only existed behind bars. He had exactly $200, a bus ticket to Los Angeles, and a dream that most people would have called delusional. He wanted to become a professional chef at a world-class restaurant. Not a line cook, not a prep worker, an executive chef. The first reality check came within hours. Henderson's mother had arranged for him to stay with family while he figured things out. South Central Los Angeles looked familiar, but felt alien. The neighborhood where he dealt drugs had changed. Some of his former associates were dead. Others were still locked up, serving sentences longer than his. A few had disappeared into witness protection after cooperating with federal prosecutors. Nobody was waiting to welcome home the conquering hero. Because Henderson wasn't a hero. He was an ex-convict, a felon, someone who'd contributed to the destruction of his own community by selling poison for profit. He understood this now in ways he hadn't at 24. Prison had given Henderson something unexpected. Time to think, time to read, time to confront who he'd been and who he wanted to become. According to his later accounts, he'd read his first book in prison, started attending classes, studied subjects he'd never cared about as a teenager. Black history, business, self-improvement literature. He'd also studied the inmates around him, the white-collar criminals who'd built empires before their convictions. Michael Milken hadn't just stolen money. He'd revolutionized junk bonds, understood markets, controlled billions. Rosario Gambino hadn't been some street-level thug. He'd run sophisticated international operations requiring logistics, coordination, and strategic thinking. Henderson realized something crucial. These men weren't smarter than him. They just had access to different opportunities, better education, connections, legal ways to build wealth. But they all ate food, and Henderson had learned to cook in a way that made them feel human again. That skill was going to be his ticket, except nobody wanted to hire a convicted felon. Henderson started applying to restaurants across Los Angeles. He had no formal training, no culinary school degree, no references from recognized chefs. His work experience was listed as head cook, federal prison system. Multiple applications went out every week. The responses were predictable. Silence, or worse, interviews that started promising and ended the moment Henderson disclosed his criminal record. California law required disclosure on job applications. The question appeared on every form. Have you been convicted of felony? Henderson checked yes, and watched opportunity after opportunity disappear. One restaurant manager told him directly, "We can't have someone with your background handling food for our customers. It's a liability." Another said, "Maybe try fast food. They're less particular." The rejection accumulated. Days became weeks. Henderson's $200 dwindled. Pride became negotiable. He needed work. Any work. The streets that had once made him wealthy now represented the easy path back to quick money. Former associates reached out. Offers came. The drug trade hadn't disappeared just because Henderson went to prison. There were openings for someone with his experience, connections, understanding of the market. Henderson said no. This was the moment that separated his story from thousands of others. Because refusing that money required something more than willpower, it required believing that the legitimate path would eventually work despite all evidence suggesting otherwise. Then he met Chef Robert Gadsby. Gadsby ran fine dining operations in Beverly Hills. High-end restaurants serving celebrities, executives, people who'd never set foot in South Central Los Angeles. Henderson had networked his way to an introduction, using the same social skills that had built his drug operation. The meeting was straightforward. Henderson explained his background, the prison sentence, the time in the kitchen, his desire to become a professional chef. Gadsby listened without interrupting. When Henderson finished, Gadsby asked one question. Can you wash dishes? Not cook. Not prepare food. Wash dishes. Henderson had been the head cook at a federal prison. He'd prepared meals for mafia associates and Wall Street criminals. He'd run a sophisticated underground catering operation that earned respect from guards and inmates alike. And Chef Robert Gadsby was offering him a dishwashing position. Henderson accepted immediately. He understood what Gadsby was offering wasn't just employment. It was apprenticeship, a chance to learn professional cooking from someone who'd worked in kitchens that made Terminal Island look primitive. An opportunity to prove himself in an environment where his past didn't automatically disqualify him. The work started at $5.75 per hour. Henderson had made more than that per minute selling crack cocaine. But this money was clean, legal, a foundation to build on. The Beverly Hills restaurant where Gadsby placed Henderson was a different universe from prison. Fresh ingredients arrived daily. Herbs Henderson had never heard of, produced in varieties that didn't exist in institutional kitchens. Fish so fresh it had been swimming that morning. Cuts of meat that cost more per pound than Henderson's weekly salary. He soaked up everything. Between washing dishes, Henderson watched the line cooks. How they moved, how they communicated during service. The precision in their cuts. The timing that allowed multiple dishes to reach completion simultaneously. The systems that prevented chaos when orders stacked up. He arrived early, stayed late, volunteered for prep work, asked questions during slow periods, made himself indispensable not through talent, but through reliability and hunger to learn. Gadsby noticed. 3 months into the dishwashing job, Henderson got promoted to prep cook, chopping vegetables, making stocks, basic work that taught fundamentals. Another 6 months, and he was working a station during service. Simple dishes at first, gradually more complex. The other cooks were mostly Latino, immigrants who'd learned to cook from family, who worked brutal hours for modest pay, who took pride in their craft despite the grinding conditions. They taught Henderson things culinary school never covered. Street knowledge applied to professional kitchens. How to work injured. How to handle abuse from head chefs. How to stay focused during 18-hour shifts. Henderson credits these line cooks more than anyone for his technical development. The formal chefs taught him technique, but the Latino workers taught him survival, work ethic, the understanding that being good wasn't enough. You had to be reliable under pressure. But Henderson was still a convicted felon. That reality followed him everywhere. When Gadsby recommended him for positions at other restaurants, Henderson had to disclose his record. Some doors opened. Many didn't. He worked at Coronado Island Marriott, then Ritz-Carlton, Hotel Bel Air, L'Hermitage in Beverly Hills. Each position was better than the last. More responsibility, higher-end cuisine, greater recognition, but also higher scrutiny. Because Henderson wasn't just representing himself. He was representing the possibility that people with criminal records could transform. The pressure was immense. One mistake, and he wasn't just failing personally. He was confirming every stereotype about felons. Every assumption that people like him couldn't change. Every justification restaurants used for not hiring ex-convicts. Henderson didn't make mistakes. He showed up on time. Every shift. Worked harder than expected. Stayed later than required. Learned faster than his peers. Not because he was naturally gifted, but because failure wasn't an option. The streets were always there. The easy money. The quick return to what he knew. Choosing the hard path meant being exceptional when average would have been easier. By 1999, 3 years after his release, Henderson had built a resume that looked impossible. Federal prison cook to dishwasher to prep cook to line cook to sous chef. Multiple high-end restaurants. References from respected chefs. Skills that had been tested under real pressure. But he wanted more. Las Vegas was booming. Mega resorts were opening on the Strip. Caesar's Palace, Bellagio, MGM Grand. These weren't just hotels. They were culinary destinations. Celebrity chefs were building empires. Wolfgang Puck, Emeril Lagasse, Bobby Flay. The restaurant industry was changing, and Las Vegas was the center of that change. Henderson moved to Vegas in 2000. He applied to Caesar's Palace, disclosed his felony conviction, waited for the rejection that had become familiar. Except this time, something different happened. The executive team was willing to take a chance. Not a big chance, a calculated one. They'd give Henderson a chef position. Not executive chef, but a real opportunity to prove himself. The title was chef de cuisine, in charge of specific restaurants within the Caesars complex. The first African-American to hold that position at Caesars Palace. The pressure was even more intense now, because Henderson wasn't just an ex-convict trying to succeed. He was breaking racial barriers in an industry that had historically excluded black chefs from top positions. 1 year into the job, Henderson was named Las Vegas Chef of the Year by the American Tasting Institute. The same guy who'd crushed Doritos in a sock for seasoning at Terminal Island, who'd served time for drug trafficking, who'd started as a dishwasher at minimum wage. In 2002, Bellagio offered Henderson the executive chef position at Café Bellagio, one of the most prestigious restaurants in Las Vegas, grossing $25 million annually. Henderson accepted, and the first dish he put on the menu was prison fried chicken, the same recipe he'd developed behind bars. Commissary techniques translated to professional ingredients. The chicken that guards had broken protocol to request, that Rosario Gambino had endorsed, that had built Henderson's reputation in an environment where reputation meant survival. The president and CEO of Bellagio ate it regularly. They didn't know the origin. Henderson and his kitchen staff would laugh because executives who'd never seen the inside of a prison were praising a dish perfected in federal custody. The symbolism wasn't lost on Henderson. His past wasn't something to hide. It was the foundation of everything he'd built. The prison kitchen had given him skills, but more importantly, it had given him perspective, understanding that food was more than nutrition. It was connection, comfort, memory, hope. He was no longer the prison chef who ruled the block. He was Chef Jeff Henderson, executive chef at one of the world's premier hotels, making more money legitimately than he'd ever made illegally. Respected, not feared, building something that couldn't be taken away by arrest or imprisonment. But the question remained, did the system work, or did Henderson succeed despite it? Because for every Jeff Henderson who transformed his life, there were thousands of ex-convicts who couldn't find employment, who faced the same rejections Henderson faced, but didn't have the same resilience or opportunities, who returned to crime not because they wanted to, but because the straight path remained closed. Henderson knew this. He'd seen it, lived it. The difference between his success and their failure often came down to one person willing to take a chance. One chef, Robert Gadsby, who offered a dishwashing job instead of another closed door. The prison system hadn't rehabilitated Henderson. Henderson had rehabilitated himself using whatever resources he could find. The kitchen job was luck. The inmates who mentored him were luck. The education programs were luck. His release into a world where fine dining was expanding was luck. Skill and determination mattered, but so did circumstance. And as Henderson stood in the kitchen at Café Bellagio, managing a staff, overseeing service for hundreds of guests daily, building wealth and reputation in a future his younger self couldn't have imagined, he understood something crucial about the American criminal justice system. It wasn't designed to create stories like his. He'd succeeded against the design, through gaps and accidents, and people who saw potential instead of just a criminal record. The system that locked him up hadn't prepared him for freedom. The prison that housed him hadn't offered systematic culinary training. The society that released him hadn't welcomed him back. Henderson had built his own path, and that path, impossible as it seemed, was now helping others. Jeff Henderson walked out of federal prison after serving nearly 10 years of his 19-and-a-half-year sentence. 9 years, 7 months, and 18 days, to be exact. He was 32 years old, a convicted felon, no formal culinary training, no professional references beyond inmates and correctional staff, and a dream that most people told him was impossible. He wanted to become an executive chef. The statistics were against him. According to Bureau of Justice data from that period, roughly 2/3 of released prisoners were rearrested within 3 years. Employment was the single biggest predictor of whether someone succeeded or failed after release. And for convicted felons, employment opportunities were scarce. Most employers wouldn't even look at applications with conviction histories. Even entry-level positions were closed to people with records. Henderson knew this. He'd heard it from counselors, from other inmates preparing for release, from the bureaucrats processing his paperwork. The world outside didn't want convicted drug dealers, especially not black convicted drug dealers from South Central Los Angeles. The doors were closed before he could even knock. But Henderson had learned something crucial in prison. Doors weren't really closed. They were just guarded by people who needed convincing, and he knew how to convince people. He'd done it with Rosario Gambino, with Michael Milken, with guards who risked their careers to eat his food, with inmates who protected him because he made their lives better. He could do it again. His first stop wasn't a restaurant. It was research. Henderson spent time at bookstores reading culinary magazines. He studied which chefs were making headlines, which restaurants were winning awards, which culinary movements were defining the industry. He noticed something. 3 black chefs kept appearing. Marcus Samuelson, working his way up in New York. Patrick Clark, revolutionizing American cuisine. And Robert Gadsby, running a fine dining establishment in Beverly Hills. Henderson made a decision. He would go to Gadsby's restaurant, not to apply, to study. He needed to see what professional kitchens looked like, how they operated, what the gap was between prison cooking and real culinary artistry. He walked into Gadsby's in Beverly Hills wearing the best clothes he owned. Not much. A clean shirt, pressed pants from a thrift store. The kind of outfit that screamed, "I'm trying rather than I belong here." The restaurant was elegant. White tablecloths, crystal glasses. The kind of place where Henderson's drug money might have gotten him a table, but his current situation wouldn't get him past the host stand. He asked to speak with Chef Gadsby. The staff looked at him like he was lost. Disheveled ex-convict wanting to talk to one of Los Angeles' top black chefs? They told him to leave an application. Henderson refused. He said he needed 5 minutes. Just 5 minutes to explain his situation. The host finally relented, probably to avoid a scene. Chef Robert Gadsby came out from the kitchen, irritated at the interruption during service. Henderson didn't waste time. He told the truth. Former drug dealer, federal prison, nearly 10 years inside, taught himself to cook. Head cook for inmates, including mob figures and Wall Street criminals. No formal training. No references that mattered in the civilian world. But a passion that wouldn't quit and a work ethic that prison had refined. Gadsby listened, and then he did something Henderson didn't expect. He offered him a job, not as a cook, as a dishwasher, the lowest position in the kitchen. The job Henderson had started with in prison. The job he'd left behind years ago. Henderson took it without hesitation, because he understood what Gadsby was offering. Not just employment, a test. Gadsby was giving him the chance to prove that his prison transformation was real, that his skills translated to professional kitchens, that he could handle the discipline, the pressure, the standards of fine dining. Henderson washed dishes like his life depended on it, because it did. He showed up early, stayed late, never complained, never cut corners. And most importantly, he watched everything. The way Gadsby managed the line, how he organized stations, the timing of dishes, the precision of plating, the communication between kitchen and front of house. Within weeks, Gadsby promoted him to prep cook, chopping vegetables, making stocks, basic tasks, but ones that taught fundamentals. Henderson absorbed it all. He asked questions during slow periods, studied the menu on his own time, practiced knife skills at home until his hands cramped. 3 months in, Gadsby put him on the line. Actual cooking during service. High pressure, professional standards. No room for the improvisations that worked in prison. Everything had to be exact, consistent, repeatable. Henderson excelled. Gadsby later said in interviews that Henderson was one of the most focused cooks he'd ever trained. Someone who treated every plate like it mattered, who never made the same mistake twice, who understood that cooking at this level was about discipline, not creativity. Save the creativity for when you'd mastered the fundamentals. After a year with Gadsby, Henderson was ready to move on. He knew he'd learned what he could there. It was time to build a resume. He worked at the Coronado Island Marriott, then the Ritz-Carlton in Marina del Rey, then Hotel Bel Air in Los Angeles, then L'Hermitage Hotel in Beverly Hills. Each move was a step up. Better kitchens, more responsibility, higher profile establishments. But Henderson wanted more. He'd heard about Las Vegas, the booming restaurant scene, celebrity chefs opening flagship locations, massive hotels competing for dining reputation. It was where careers were made, where an executive chef position meant running million-dollar operations. In 2000, Henderson moved to Vegas. He started applying to every major property on the Strip: Caesar's Palace, MGM Grand, Bellagio, Mandalay Bay. The rejections came fast. Convicted felon, no culinary degree, resume built on prison cooking and a few years of real kitchen work. Not exactly what elite Las Vegas properties were looking for in their leadership. Henderson kept applying, and finally, Caesar's Palace gave him an interview. Multiple interviews, actually. They vetted him thoroughly. Background checks, reference calls, conversations about his conviction and his time inside. Henderson didn't hide anything. He told them the truth. Former drug dealer. Prison transformed him. Cooking saved his life. He would work harder than anyone else because he had more to prove. Caesar's Palace hired him, not as executive chef, not yet, but as chef de cuisine, managing specific restaurants within the property. And he made history. The first African-American chef de cuisine at Caesar's Palace in Las Vegas. The pressure was immense. Caesar's Palace wasn't some neighborhood restaurant. It was a Vegas institution. Celebrities, high rollers, guests who expected perfection. Any mistake would reflect not just on Henderson, but on every black chef fighting for opportunities in an industry dominated by white leadership. Henderson didn't just meet expectations. He exceeded them. His food was exceptional. His management was tight. His kitchens ran smoothly. In 2001, the American Tasting Institute named him Las Vegas Chef of the Year. 1 year out of Caesar's Palace, barely 5 years removed from federal prison, Henderson had become one of the most recognized chefs in Las Vegas. The recognition opened bigger doors. In 2002, the Bellagio offered him executive chef position at Cafe Bellagio. Henderson accepted. Now he was running one of the most prestigious kitchens in the world. The Bellagio was synonymous with luxury. Its restaurants were destinations. Its culinary program was legendary. And Henderson, the former crack dealer who taught himself to cook by crushing Doritos in a sock, was in charge. He brought his prison fried chicken to the menu. The same recipe he'd made for Gambino. The same technique he developed with limited ingredients and improvised seasonings. He elevated it. Professional equipment. Premium chicken. Perfect execution. But the core was the same. Executives from the Bellagio's parent company would come down to Cafe Bellagio specifically for that chicken. They'd sit in the dining room eating prison fried chicken, not knowing its origins, praising Henderson for his innovation. He and his staff would laugh about it in the kitchen afterward. The irony was perfect. The dish that had given him power behind bars was now giving him success beyond them. But success brought responsibility. Henderson started speaking at prisons, sharing his story, not to glamorize his past, but to show inmates that transformation was possible, that the skills they developed inside could translate outside if they committed to legitimate paths. He talked about the hierarchy of hunger, how food had given him power in prison and purpose after release. In 2007, HarperCollins published Henderson's memoir, Cooked: My Journey from the Streets to the Stove. The book became a New York Times bestseller. Oprah Winfrey interviewed him. Sony Pictures bought the film rights. Will Smith's production company signed on to develop the movie. Henderson left the Bellagio to focus on other ventures. He hosted the Chef Jeff Project on the Food Network, a show where he took at-risk youth and trained them in his catering company, Posh Urban Cuisine. He launched Flip My Food, teaching people to make healthier versions of comfort foods. He became a motivational speaker, traveling the country with a message about redemption and second chances. He created the Chef Jeff Project, a nonprofit in Las Vegas providing culinary and leadership training for disadvantaged youth and adults. The program helped prepare people for careers in culinary and hospitality industries. Henderson had gone from being someone the system wrote off to someone creating pathways for others to succeed. The transformation was complete, but Henderson never forgot where it started. In a prison kitchen, with crushed Doritos and a desire to make something better than what was expected. With influential inmates who became customers and taught him that value transcends circumstances. With the realization that food wasn't just sustenance. It was power, currency, and ultimately redemption. Years later, in interviews, Henderson would say that prison saved his life. That without that decade behind bars, he'd be dead or permanently trapped in the drug trade. That the kitchen gave him something he'd never had before. Purpose, direction, a skill that was legitimate and valuable. And he'd talk about the men who ate his food, Rosario Gambino and his fried chicken, Michael Milken and his cheesecake, the guards who broke protocol, the other inmates who protected him because he made their lives marginally less miserable. They weren't just customers. They were proof that everyone, regardless of their past or their crimes, craved the same thing: to feel human, to have moments of pleasure in places designed to strip pleasure away, to taste something that reminded them of freedom. Jeff Henderson provided that, first in prison, then in some of the world's finest restaurants, and finally, through a career that proved the most important ingredient in any recipe isn't found in a kitchen. It's found in the decision to transform yourself when everyone expects you to fail. Henderson had ruled the block with a spatula and a sock full of chips. But he'd conquered the world by refusing to let his past define his future. By understanding that the skills that gave him power in one system could be redirected to create value in another. By proving that redemption isn't about forgetting where you came from. It's about using where you've been to get somewhere better. The prison chef who ruled the block became the executive chef who showed the world that second chances aren't just possible. When paired with purpose, discipline, and an unwillingness to accept limitations, they're inevitable. Today, Jeff Henderson is more than just a chef. He's proof that the American prison system, designed to punish and contain, can accidentally create something it never intended. Transformation, purpose, second chances that actually work. But here's what most people miss about Henderson's story. It wasn't about cooking. Not really. It was about understanding power. About recognizing that in any system, whether it's a prison block or a five-star kitchen or the streets of South Central, the same rules apply. Value creates protection. Skill creates opportunity. And being indispensable creates freedom. Henderson learned that with crushed Doritos and a borrowed spatula. He proved it at Caesar's Palace and the Bellagio. And he's still teaching it today through his foundation, his speaking, his refusal to let anyone's past become their prison. Rosario Gambino served his 45 years. He was released in 2009 and died in 2021 at age 86. Michael Milken was pardoned by President Trump in 2020. He's now worth an estimated $4 billion. The guards who ate Henderson's food? Most have retired. The prison kitchen at Terminal Island still operates, still employs inmates, still creates the same hierarchies. But none of them changed the game the way Henderson did. Because Henderson didn't just survive the system. He studied it, mastered it, then used what he learned to build something the system said was impossible. A legitimate career, a respected name, a legacy that helps others escape the cycles that trapped him. The prison chef who ruled the block with fried chicken became the executive chef who rules kitchens with excellence. The drug dealer who made $35,000 a week selling poison became the mentor who makes $0 helping at-risk youth find better paths. That's not redemption. That's revolution. And if you think Henderson's story is unique, you're wrong. There are inmates right now in kitchens across America's prison system learning skills that could change their lives. The question isn't whether they have the talent. Henderson proved talent exists everywhere. The question is whether they'll get the chance. Whether someone will give them 5 minutes like Gatsby did. Whether they'll take the dishwasher job and prove themselves. whether they'll understand that the hustle that got them locked up can be redirected towards something that sets them free. Henderson bet everything on that possibility, and he won. If this story changed how you think about prison, redemption, or second chances, do us a favor. Share it, because somewhere, someone needs to hear that their past doesn't have to be their future, that the skills they're learning in the hardest places can work in the best ones, that a sock full of crushed chips can be the first step toward a Michelin-worthy kitchen. And if you want more stories about people who defied every expectation, who transformed in places designed to destroy them, who proved that human potential can't be locked away no matter how thick the walls are, hit that subscribe button. Turn on notifications, because we're just getting started. Next week, we're covering the inmate who became a Supreme Court lawyer from his cell. No law degree, no formal training, just a library card and a refusal to accept that justice was out of reach. You won't want to miss it.